Hello, I'm Usacheva, a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Helsinki. In the first lecture of this mini-series, I spoke about the early Christian Ensoulment theories within the framework of Dualist Psychological Discourse of Hellenic philosophy. I have argued that the fundamental metaphysical principles of Christian doctrine imply that a dualist build-up of human nature is balanced out by the essentially holistic synergic activity of the human being. Today I shall analyze the contributions of two 5th-century authors in order to introduce a comparison between the early Christian period and the later time. In the 5th century, the heated theological debates about the union of the human and divine natures in Christ and about the circumstances of Christ's conception and birth enhanced theological interest to the mysteries of reproduction. Theodoret of Cyrus and Nemesius of Emesa, whose legacies I examine today, could be classed as representatives of the Antiochian school of theology. Another common characteristic of these authors is that, compared to previous Christian writers, they held somewhat innovative views of reproduction. Theodoret of Cyrus, for example, denied comprehensive ensoulment at the moment of conception, and instead he believed in incremental ensoulment. He also explicitly argued for internal ensoulment, although he did allow that divine assistance was provided through the means of providence and the operation of the natural law of human physiology established by God at creation. In such a way, with a reference to a fragment of Exodus 21:22, Theodoret claims, in a special chapter entitled Periphysos Anthropou, on the nature of man, that the ensoulment of the foetus happens only after it has been fully formed in the mother's womb. In a different treatise, and again with reference to the same passage of Exodus, Theodoret claims that the foetus, which is altogether formed in the womb, has the soul, while the yet unformed foetus does not have it. To support his opinion, Theodoret alludes to the well-known passage from the book of Genesis that infers the sequential character of human creation. The well-known passage goes as follows: "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." End of quote, from Genesis 2:7. This biblical citation concurred with the conviction shared by Aristotle, Galen, and Neoplatonists that the soul can only enter a fully formed body. As I have argued in the previous lecture, Aristotle and Galen believed in incremental ensoulment, while the Platonists affirmed that the sensitive and intellectual souls enter the body only at birth. Although Theodoret did not specify the time of ensoulment, neither did he elaborate on the sequence of the formation of the bodily organs, yet it seems likely that in his opinion ensoulment took place sometime before birth. The passage from Exodus, which he repeatedly referred to, describes the case of a miscarriage or a premature birth, which proved that sometimes the foetus came out completely formed and alive, while sometimes it did not. With a reference to Job 10:9-12, Theodoret states the following sequence of the reproduction process, and I quote: "At first, the small semen takes on 1,000 forms, and then the soul is formed and joined with the body. After the throes of childbirth, divine aid protects and guides the child." End of quote. Interestingly, according to Theodoret's logic, this seemingly dualist embryology of his coincided with the holistic anthropological ideas of previous church fathers. Thus, Theodoret maintained, and I quote, "The Church, complying with the words of God, despises the view of such heretics and turns away from such myths and following the scripture believes that the soul is created together with the body and that it is not from the matter of the seed, hence it has the origin of its creation. Importantly, the last part of this citation, which might create an impression that Theodoret supported the external theory of ensoulment, should be compared with his other statements. In the cited passage from Periphysius Anthropo, Theodoret declared that after the foetus is fully formed in the mother's womb, it receives the soul. He then developed this idea as follows. He claimed that the foetus receives the soul, and I quote, but not in such a way that the soul comes from the outside, nor that it is engendered from the seed, but from the natural law from the beginning established by God, the foetus receives its being. End of quote. Clearly, in this passage, Theodoret implies the joint operation of human physiology and divine providence. Thus, in a different treatise, he wrote, I quote, nowadays still, by the will of the Creator, the embryo is created in the mother's womb, and the nature follows the rules established by God at the beginning. Similarly, then, at the time of the first creation, according to his will, the human body was made up of earth, and the clay became flesh, blood, skin, fat, nerves, veins and arteries, brain and marrow. End of quote. It is difficult to detect any particular philosophical or medical influence on Theodoret's views on reproduction. He explicitly mentioned a wide range of special philosophical and medical literature and even analyzed several different theories about reproduction in the introduction to his chapter Periphysius Anthropo. He explicitly mentioned such authors as Pythagoras, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Xenophon, and Plotinus. Unlike Theodoret, his contemporary Nemesius of Emesa criticized those who believe that cooperation of the human physiology and divine providence can account for the reproduction of the human life. Nemesius pointed out the difference between divine providence, focused on the preservation of life, and the first creation of life ex nihilo. According to Nemesius, if the souls were born from internal reproduction and not created ex nihilo, they would be mortal. Nemesius also rejected the idea that souls were born from souls, like bodies were born from bodies. He ascribed this idea to Apollinaris, a famous heretic. Nemesius declared this position a blasphemy because in his eyes it represented God as an accomplice of adulteress, because, as he argued, children are begotten by them also. In addition, Nemesius renounced the belief that souls are created by God at the moment of conception. In his view, this statement contradicted a passage from Genesis 2:2, claiming that God rested from all the works he had made. Thus, Nemesius was left with the only logical explanation of ensoulment, the pre-existence of the soul. Although he never explicitly acknowledged that such was his view, the rationale of his argument does not suggest any other alternative. This indirect support of pre-existence made Nemesius appear, in the eyes of many scholars, a supporter of the Neoplatonic teaching, and especially of Platonic substance dualism. Indeed, Nemesius explicitly cited such Neoplatonic authors as Ammonius and Porphyry, with particularly his Miscellanous questions. He referred to these authors as authorities in the question of the unconfused union, which was a heated topic in the Christological debates of his time. Naturally, the context of the Neoplatonic discussion around the specific kind of union between intelligible substances was very different from the theological debates about the union between the human and divine natures of Christ, and also from the theological debates about the union between the intelligible and material substances, like intelligible soul and material body. Thus, for example, when Porphyry described the divine and paradoxical kind of union between the vegetative souls of mother and father in his Ad Gaurum, Porphyry spoke about the souls, that is to say, about intelligible substances, and not about intelligible and material substance. Hence, the union between soul and body, and even the union between intelligible divine and complex human natures of Christ, did not exactly fit the context of the Neoplatonic discussion. However, it is also true that in Neoplatonic teaching, the vegetative soul has the complicated status of a medium between the intelligible abstract reality of forms and the empirical reality of the sensible world. If we add to this consideration the fact that Porphyry and also Nemesius admitted that the soul can suffer together with its body, the so to speak gray zone localization of the vegetative soul becomes clear. Nemesius argued that the soul, and I quote, while remaining one and the same in substance, changes its qualities, passing from ignorance to knowledge, from badness to goodness. And he also argued that unless the soul manages to attune its body through reason and character, it will be perverted together with it. If we add to these anti-dualist synergic views of Nemesius his profound knowledge and admiration of Galen, who himself declared his allegiance to the Platonic school of philosophy, while at the same time created his essentially naturalistic psychosomatic psychology, well, if we acknowledge all this, we will be able to see the logic of Nemesius' eclectic views. I believe that Nemesius used Neoplatonic concepts solely for the benefit of his own argumentation, and with no binding influence of the philosophical notions on his metaphysical principles. Nevertheless, it is open to conjecture whether Nemesius was himself unaware of the distinction between Neoplatonic and Christian discourses around the conception of the unconfused union, or whether he deliberately chose to ignore this distinction for some reason of his own. On the one hand, sometimes Nemesius gave rather loose accounts of famous philosophical theories, but on the other hand, his knowledge of Porphyry was truly considerable. I believe that whatever Nemesius' doxographical principles were, he clearly felt free to give his interpretation of the philosophical concepts, because the chief goal of his treatise was not doxographical, but independent and creative. The rationale of Nemesius' anthropology was fundamentally different from the hierarchical structure of the Neoplatonic universe. Although he accepted the substantial difference between intelligible soul and material body, he repeatedly praised and admired the unity between these different substances. For example, Nemesius employed a term introduced by Theodore of Mopsuestia, another famous Antiochian theologian, who called man the bond of creation, syndesmos. So the bond with which join together intelligible and material substances for the benefit of both. For example, in his commentary on Romans, Theodore said that by joining the soul with the body, God created man, a bond of creation, syndesmos tesktisios. With reference to the Mosaic story of creation and similarly to Theodore, Nemesius asserted as follows: when intelligible reality and also visible reality had come to be, something needed to come to be to bind them both together, so that everything should be one and in sympathy with itself, and not foreign itself to itself. So man, the animal that binds both natures together, came to be. End of quote. Significantly, Nemesius viewed man not simply as a boundary between different spheres, but as a fundamental joint. He called man microcosmos, and thus he manifested organic continuity between visible and intelligible spheres. Moreover, Nemesius also called man the image of the whole creation, basis ktiseos ten eikona, which may appear as a development of Theodore's syndesmostes ktiseos, a bond of creation. It is also interesting that Nemesius never explicitly called man the image of God, which was a clear shift from the popular anthropological views of the Cappadocian Fathers. In his depiction of the organic unity between man and cosmos, Nemesius went further than mere declarations. Thus, his treatise contains multiple examples of the human psychosomatic integrity and human physiological and psychological continuity, as well as Nemesius' teleological explanations of all these phenomena. Thus, for example, he wrote as follows: if the surroundings are dry, bodies become dry, if not all in the same way. And if mother lives an unhealthy life and is luxurious, her children will in consequence be born with a poor bodily temperament and wayward in their impulses. So it is clear from what has been said that people may find themselves with an unfavorable bodily temperament either through the general environment or through the preferred lifestyle of their parents or through themselves being damaged by luxuriousness. End of quote. Dwelling on Galen's psychosomatic notions, Nemesius declared as follows: the Creator, in accordance with his supreme foresight, wove the functions of the soul together with the natural and vice versa. Remarkably, end of quote, Remarkably, among these psychosomatic functions, Nemesius mentioned reproduction, which, as he argued, partially is subject to impulse, to bodily impulse, and partially is subject to reason. Thus he stated about the function of reproduction that, I quote, the generative faculty belongs to the part which is not capable of obeying reason. For we eject semen in dreams without wishing it, and the desire for sexual intercourse belongs to nature, for we are moved towards it when unwilling. But the activity is uncontestably up to us and involves the soul, for it is accomplished through the organs that are subject to impulse, and it is in our power to abstain and conquer the impulse. End of quote. Another shift from the familiar Christian views brought Nemesius' support of Galen's two-seed theory. So Nemesius also believed that there is not only male seed but also female seed. Although Nemesius challenged some widespread Christian psychological ideas in many ways, yet his efforts to smooth out the dualist character of human nature unmistakably matches the complex, dualist, holistic nature of Christian doctrine, which I described in the first lecture and which I also tried to trace in this present lecture. Thus, Nemesius, in tune with such early Christian authors as Paul, Irenaeus of Lyon, and other early Christian authors, professed that since the soul is already immortal, the salvific efforts of man should be focused on the transformation of the body, understood as the psychosomatic unity of an individual person. In other words, the teleological goal of the soul, according to Nemesis, is to bring the body to immortality. Thus he wrote, I quote, "Man was created mortal, but capable of becoming immortal if perfected by progress. In other words, potentially immortal." This task of reaching bodily immortality, in Nemesis' view, has a cosmological perspective because of the initial divine design to bind together intelligible and corporeal natures through humans. Now to the conclusion. From the 2nd and until the 5th century, Christian authors, together with Aristotle, Plato, and their followers, denied the existence of the female seed proposed by Hippocrates and his famous follower Galen. Although theologians and philosophers unanimously believe that the embryo is formed out of the male seed and menses, they had different views of the process of conception. Thus, unlike Aristotle and Galen, and similarly to Platonists, Christians stood for the external theory of ensoulment, which complied with their religious dogmas about creation, incarnation, and resurrection. Then, similarly to Aristotle and Galen, and unlike Platonists, Christians held a holistic view of soul and body union. Again, similarly to Aristotle and Galen, and unlike the Platonists, Christians supported epigenesis. However, while Aristotle and Galen complemented their epigenetic concepts with a belief in incremental ensoulment, Christians affirmed comprehensive ensoulment at the moment of conception. Christian views on this issue also was different from the Platonic conviction that ensoulment happens at the moment of birth. Unlike everyone, medical doctors and Hellenic philosophers, Christians were strong opponents of abortion. Christian authors did not speculate upon the minute details of conception, which could account for the heredity traits of both parents. Theologians regarded the male seed as a vehicle of the principle of physical formation, while menses supplied the nutrition for the growing foetus. These ideas, however, should not rule out the possibility that Christians accepted the transmission of maternal heredity traits, as did also Aristotle, Platonists, and Galen, although they did it with different explanations. Since Christians admitted divine assistance at conception, why perhaps should not expect from them a perfectly natural explanation of all embryological processes? Thus, in the case of Christ's conception, theologians proclaimed that Mary mysteriously transmitted the nature of David and Abraham so that Christ could be lawfully called their descendant. In the 5th century, Christian interest in the mysteries of reproduction was heated by the Christological debates. Some novel views of ensoulment were introduced by such representatives of the Antiochian school of theology as Theodoret of Cyrus and Nemesius of Emesa. For example, Theodoret reduced the extent of divine assistance at ensoulment to the joint operation of providence and human nature. He also renounced comprehensive ensoulment at the moment of conception. Nemesius' devotion to Galen and Porphyry made him an explicit supporter of the two-seed embryology and an indirect proponent of the pre-existence of the souls. Nevertheless, Nemesius also retained a continuity with the Antiochian exegetical tradition, for example with Theodore of Mopsuestia. Nemesis gave an essentially holistic interpretation of the unconfused union of intelligible and corporeal natures in man. A brief analysis of Theodoret and Nemesis' views of reproduction demonstrate that although these authors closely engaged with Aristotelian, Galenic, and Neoplatonic concepts, their ideas preserve continuity with the early Christian concepts. Thus, Theodoret and Nemesis tried to outbalance the concept of the dualist human nature by emphasizing its functional unity, which they regarded as the essential point of the divine plan concerning creation and salvation. At the beginning of my talk, I presented a hypothesis that, despite plentiful influences of various philosophical and medical embryological concepts, the rationale of Christian reproduction theory remained rather peculiar and faithful to the complex, dualist, holistic nature of Christian thought. Hopefully, this brief summary of the hitherto described concepts has made my hypothesis trustworthy. Now, thank you very much for your attention, and many thanks to the current board of the International Association for Patristic Studies for this kind invitation to join and contribute to this YouTube channel. And I hope you've enjoyed the video, and please don't forget to give your likes if you did. Take care and goodbye.